Hi, this is Professor Gita Shah teaching you Chapter 2 today. Chapter 2 is on trade-offs, comparative advantage and the market system. Chapter outline and learning objectives. After finishing this chapter, you will be able to discuss production possibilities, frontiers and opportunity cost. You will be able to calculate competitive advantage and creating trades. And you will be able to discuss about different market system. Scarcity and trade-offs. Households, firms and governments continually face decisions about how best to use their scarce resources. Scarcity. Scarcity is a situation in which unlimited wants exceed the limited resources available to fulfill those wants. Scarcity requires trade-offs. Economics teaches us tools to help make good trade-offs. Example, when deciding how to use its scarce workers and machinery, if Tesla wants to produce more Model X SUVs, those resources will not be available to produce Model S sedans. Production possibility frontier and opportunity cost. Use a production possibilities frontier to analyze opportunity costs and trade-off. Production possibilities frontier. A production possibilities frontier is a curve showing the maximum attainable combinations of two products that may be purchased with available resources at current technology. Question: is the PPF a positive or a normative tool? Answer: positive. It shows what is, not what should be. Production possibilities frontier for Tesla. Tesla can produce sedans or SUVs. If it wants to produce more sedans, it must reduce the number of SUVs. You can see that production possibility frontier for Tesla is linear, continuous. Why? Because all the resources producing SUVs and sedans are perfectly substituted. So, marginal rate of technical substitution remains constant here, and Tesla can choose any combination on this PPF, A, B, C, D or E, any of them, and produce both the cars at a given factors of production and given resources. You can see points on PPF are attainable for Tesla. As I said, A, B, C, D, E. Points below curve are inefficient, like F. Points above the curve are unattainable with current resources, like G. Tesla can trade off sedans for SUVs to produce 20 more SUVs, as for example, moving from A to B. Look at my cursor, moving from A to B. Tesla must produce 20 fewer sedans, like 80 to 60, 20 fewer sedans for 20 more SUVs. The 20 fewer sedans is the opportunity cost for 20 additional SUVs. Opportunity cost, the highest valued alternative that must be given up to engage in an activity. Increasing marginal opportunity costs. On the previous slide, opportunity costs were constant, but opportunity costs are often increasing. Why? Because some resources are better suited to one task than another. The first resources to switch are the one best suited or to switching. The more resources already devoted to an activity, the smaller the payoff to devoting additional resources to that activity. You can see here production possibility frontier is bored out shaped curve. Why? Because as you move from A to B, B to C, C to D, you have to give up more and more units of tanks to get the same unit of automobiles. Economic growth on the PPF. As more economic resources become available, the economy can move from point A to point B. Look at my cursor, from point A to point B, producing more tanks and more automobiles. Shift, look at the cursor, shift in the PPF shows economic growth. Again, shift on the production possibility frontier shows economic growth. Economic growth, the ability of the economy to increase production of goods and services. Technological change in one industry. Now look at this graph. In this panel, it shows technological improvement in automobile industry. Look at my cursor. Technological improvement in automobile industry. The quantity of tanks that can be produced remains the same, unchanged. As in the previous slide, many previously unattainable combinations are now attainable. And you can see the slope of the PPF changes. Again, the slope of the PPF changes. A PPF for exam grades. Suppose you have a limited amount of time to study for 2 exams, economics and accounting. What would the production possibilities curve for the exam grades look like? A straight line, like the PPF for sedans and SUVs, or bored outward curve like PPF for tanks and automobiles? Why? The first hour spent studying economics is much more valuable than the last hour. Comparative advantage and trade. Describe comparative advantage and explain how it serves as the basis for trade. PPFs for picking apples and cherries. Here, now we will see that PPF is linear. It's a constant slope. You know why? Because here the marginal rate of substitution remains the same, because we know the time needed to produce both the goods. Once you know the time to produce both the goods, the ratio of producing one good to another good remains constant. Suppose you and your neighbor each have a limited time to pick cherries and or apples. If you spend your time picking cherries, you can pick 20 pounds of cherries. If you spend your time picking apple, you can pick 20 pounds of apples. You can see it is already given in the table that if you pick 20 pounds of apples, you cannot pick any cherries. And if you pick cherries, you cannot pick any apple. PPFs for picking apples and cherries continued. If your neighbor spends all of her time picking cherries, she can pick 60 pounds of cherries. If your neighbor spends all of her time picking apples, she can pick 30 pounds of apples. Look at my cursor. Shows PP of your neighbor. She can either pick 30 pounds of apples or she can pick 60 pounds of cherries. You can see in this data, if she picks up 30 pounds of apples, she cannot pick any cherries. And if she picks 60 pounds of cherries, she cannot pick any apple. Specialization and trade. What if you and your neighbor decided to specialize and trade? What is trade? Trade is the act of buying and selling. Could your neighbor benefit from trade? When she is better at picking both apples and cherries. Both of you can benefit from trade by specializing in what you are relatively good at. Let us see how. Gains from the specialization and trade. You can see here, without trade, you can pick 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries, and you consume 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries without trade. You choose the combination on your PPF. This is your PPF. And you can see, without trade, your neighbor also chooses combination C, where she can pick 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries. And without trade, whatever she will pick, 9 pounds of apple and 42 pounds of cherries, she will consume. When you don't trade with your neighbor, you pick and consume 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries per week. On point A in panel A. When your neighbor does not trade with you, she picks and consumes 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries per week. Point C in panel B. Gains from the specialization and trade continued. Now, if you specialize in picking apples, you can pick 20 pounds of apples. If your neighbor specializes in picking cherries, she can pick 60 pounds of cherries. If you trade 10 pounds of apples for 15 pounds of your neighbor's cherries, you will be able to consume 10 pounds of apples and 15 pounds of cherries. Point B in panel A. Look at this graph. After the trade, you will specialize in picking apples. So you will spend whole week to pick 20 pounds of apples. Look at my cursor. And out of this 20 pound of apples, you will trade 10 pounds of apples with your neighbor. Look at my cursor in panel B. In return, your neighbor will give you 15 pounds of cherries, and after the trade, look at my cursor in panel A, you will get 15 pounds of cherries. And with the trade, you will able to choose combination B outside your PPF. In other words, you can shift CPF outside the PPF. And at point B, now you will consume 10 pounds of apples and 15 pounds of cherries. What's the gain from the trade for you? With the trade, you have 2 pounds of more apples and 3 pounds of more cherries. Now let us see gains from the trade for your neighbor. Your neighbor was consuming 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries without trade. With the trade, look at my cursor. She will consume 10 pounds of apples and 45 pounds of cherries. What's the gains for your neighbor? She will get 1 pound of more apple and 3 pounds of more cherries. So, your neighbor can now consume 10 pounds of apples and 40 pounds of cherries. Point D in panel B. You and your neighbor are both better off as a result of trade. Summary of gains from the trade. Look at this table. First row, production and consumption without trade. Without trade, you were picking 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries, and you were consuming 8 pounds of apple and 12 pounds of cherries. Without trade, your neighbor was picking 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries, and she was consuming 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries. Production with the trade. Now, with the trade, you specialized in the production of apples. So, you are picking only apples, and in a week, you can pick 20 pounds of apples and 0 pounds of cherries. Your neighbor specializes in the production of cherries. So, she will pick 60 pounds of cherries and 0 pounds of apples. And 0 pounds of apples. Consumption with trade. Look at here. Now, out of 20 pounds of apple, you will trade 10 pounds of apple with your neighbor. So, how many pounds of apples left for you? 10 pounds. And in return, you earn 15 pounds of cherries from your neighbor. So how many cherries left for your neighbor after giving you 15 pounds of cherries? 45 pounds of cherries. Gains from the trade. Increased consumption. Look at here. Before the trade, you were consuming 8 pounds of apple. After the trade, you consume 10 pounds of apples. So you consume 2 pounds of more apples. Before the trade, you were consuming 12 pounds of cherries. After the trade, you consume 15 pounds of cherries. So, you consume 3 pounds of more cherries after the trade. Your neighbor, she was consuming 9 pounds of apples before the trade. And after the trade, now she has 10 pounds of apples. What's the gains from the trade? She will have 1 pound of more apples. And before the trade, she was consuming 42 pounds of cherries. After the trade, she will consume 45 pounds of cherries. So what's the gain from the trade? 3 pounds of more cherries. So, gains, trade can make everyone better off. Trade can make everyone better off. Explaining gains from specialization in trade. How could both of you benefit from trade when your neighbor was so much better than you? Economists say your neighbor had an absolute advantage in both cherry and apple picking, but you had a comparative advantage in picking apples. What is absolute advantage? Absolute advantage is the ability of an individual, a firm, or a country to produce more of a good or a service than competitors using same amount of resources. Comparative advantage, the ability of an individual, a firm, or a country to produce a good or service at a lower opportunity cost than competitors. Competitive advantage and the gains from the trade. Opportunity cost of picking 1 pound of apple for you is 1 pound of cherries. And opportunity cost of picking 1 pound of cherries for you is 1 pound of apples. For your neighbor, opportunity cost of picking 1 pound of apples is 2 pounds of cherries. And for your neighbor, opportunity cost of producing 1 pound of cherries is half pound of apples. The basis for trade is comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. Individuals, firms, and countries are better off if they specialize in producing goods and services for which they have a comparative advantage and obtain the other goods and services they need by trading. Comparative advantage and housework. People living together have to divide up household chores. Basic economic concepts like comparative advantage can provide useful insight in the division of labor. Suppose Jack is faster than Jill at both cooking and laundry. However, Jack is much faster at preparing tasty meals, while Jack is only little faster at doing laundry. Jack's competitive advantage is in cooking. To cook a tasty meal, he gives up the opportunity to perform less laundry than Jill. So he should specialize in this while Jill should specialize in laundry. The market system. Explain the basic ideas of how a market system works. The two key groups in the modern economy. Two key groups participate in modern economy. Who are these two key groups? Households and firms. Look at this slide. Households, they own factors of production and then they sell factors of production. Who buys them? Firms. So you can see that households consist, look at my cursor, consist individuals who provide the factors of production. There are 4 factors of production. Look at my cursor. Labor, capital, natural resources, and entrepreneurial abilities. Households, they sell these factors of production in the factor markets and in return they receive payments. Firms, They purchase these factors of production in the factor market, convert them into goods and services, and firms supply goods and services to the product markets, where households buy these products from the firms. Now you can see this is the circular flow diagram. Look at my cursor. There are only two units interacting with one another, households and firms. It means this circular flow diagram is for market economy. In other words, here government does not intervene in the market. Look at this graph. You will not see government over here. So, this circular flow diagram is for market economy. This model that illustrates how participants in markets are linked. Households provide factors of production to firms. Firms provide goods and services to households. Look at here. Look at my cursor. Households, they provide factors of production through the factor markets to the firms. Firms convert them into goods and services, and firms provide final goods and services through product market to households. So this is the way whole economy works. Now look at here. In return, firms pay money to households for the factors of production, and households pay money to firms for goods and services. Look at my cursor. Firms spend money on factors of production by paying them wages, interest rate, dividend, rent, and spending by firms becomes income payment for households in the form of wages, rent, interest rate, and dividend. And household spend this money on buying new goods and services. Spending by households on new goods and services becomes revenue for firms. So this is the way whole economy works. The circular flow diagram, a simplified model, like all economic models, the circular flow diagram is simplified version of reality. No government, no financial system, no foreign buyers and sellers of goods. We will explore these sectors in the later chapters. The gains from free markets. A free market is one with few government restrictions on how a good or service can be produced or sold, or on how a factor of production can be employed. Countries that come closest to the free market benchmark have been more successful than those with centrally planned economies in providing their people with rising living standards. This concept is not new. Adam Smith argued for free markets in his 1776 book on an inquiry into nature and causes of the wealth of nations. The beauty of the market mechanism. It is not immediately obvious that markets will do better than centrally planned systems for satisfying human desires. After all, individuals are acting only in their own rational self-interest. But markets with flexible prices allow the collective actions of households and firms to signal the relative worth of goods and services. In this way, the invisible hand allows individual responses to collectively end up satisfying the wants of the consumers. A story of the market system in action. How do you make an iPad? Although Apple engineers designed the iPad, Apple does not manufacture iPad components, nor does it assemble the final product. Hundreds of firms are involved. Many probably don't even know their products will be used in an iPad. But guided by their own self-interest, they all contribute to the final product without any desire to enrich Apple or provide enjoyment for iPad purchasers. Role of the entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is someone who brings together the factors of production: land, labor, and capital to produce goods and services. The best entrepreneurs create products that consumers never even knew they wanted. Sir Henry Ford said this thing: "If I had asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse." Entrepreneurs make a vital contribution to economic growth, often with considerable personal risk and sacrifices. Selected products and their inventors, entrepreneurs make a vital contribution to economic growth by responding to consumer demand, introducing new products. Government policies encouraging entrepreneurship are likely to increase economic growth to raise standards of living. You can see this table 2.3, all important products introduced by entrepreneurs. The legal basis of a successful market system. In a free market, government does not restrict how firms produce and sell goods and how they employ factors of production. However, governments must provide a sound legal environment that will allow the market system to succeed, including protection of private property. See, this is the beauty of US economy, that here we have property rights. When criminals can take your wages or profits, households and firms have little incentive to work hard. Property rights, the rights individuals or firms have to the exclusive use of their property, including the right to buy or sell it, are essential here. Enforcement of contracts and property rights, important for transactions across time to occur. An independent court system is critical here. Who owns the Wizard of Oz? Copyrights and patents protect the intellectual property of creators and inventors in order to encourage innovation. But sometimes they work against innovation. For example, when Disney wanted to remake the classic 1939 movie The Wizard of Oz. They had to change many details to avoid infringing on Warner Brothers' copyright. While copyrights provide essential protection, these do not come without costs. Common misconception to avoid. The production possibilities frontier should never be inward. Why? The PPF tells us what can be produced, not what should be produced. Just because someone is better or worse at everything doesn't mean trade with them cannot be beneficial. The basis of trade is comparative advantage, not absolute advantage. Free markets raise the standard of living, but that doesn't mean there is no role for governments. Governments must provide a sound legal environment to allow the market system to succeed. So, in this chapter, we learnt about production possibility frontiers, we learnt about gains from the trade, and we learnt about the circular flow model and market economy.